Jay, we're back again with another episode thanks to our Dig Me Out Union on Patreon. You can help us make the next episode happen by joining us at dmounion.com or digmeoutunion.com. And joining us for this interview episode, once again, Chip Midnight, welcome back.
Thanks for having me as always.
Chip, you've gone out with your trusty microphone and hunted down a new guest to interview.
I have.
Would you like to share?
I'm picturing Chip running around with like a net and a microphone.
He's got a big boomstick, and he's just running around with this big boomstick.
And like I watched Get Back recently, and like running around maybe with a whole tape player like in a bag over my shoulder, running around chasing people.
That's
what I do. Yes.
Yeah.
So I spoke with a gentleman named Adam Elk from the band The Mommyheads. And so the reason I sort of pause on his name is his real name is Adam Cohen. And he went by that throughout many of the years while in The Mommyheads. And at one point, Leonard Cohen's son, who coincidentally is named Adam, started a recording career, and some label was putting out an Leonard Cohen's son CD. And so just to avoid that confusion, Adam changed his last name and now goes by Adam Elk.
That's very courteous of him.
Right.
Yes. So the Mommyheads, I don't know if you guys are familiar. The name definitely rang a bell with me.
Yeah, the name rang a bell.
A very, very 90s name too.
Yeah. And I know, we talk about this, or you guys talk about this, and I talk about this a lot on the podcast, is there was so much music in the 90s that I know that I owned a Mommyhead CD at some point. I might still have it in a box somewhere. But I was shuffling through so much music back in those days that I don't remember it very well. But they really only put out one major label record. It came out in 1997, and it was Selftitled. The thing, as you guys have uncovered over the last 10 years, is the album came out. There was a staff shakeup at Geffen, and right after the album came out, all the support that they had within the label was gone. And so essentially they were out on the road and without really any sort of label support, and it fizzled before it started. Honestly, the album sort of barely made it out. And I think Adam has talked about in other interviews that because the album was already out, Geffen didn't decide to pull it off the shelves, but they did nothing to promote it. But the interesting thing, and we talk about this a lot in the interview and uncover a lot of it, is they came out of the late 80s New York scene. So Adam mentions in the interview that he was a frequent visitor of places like CBGB's and Max's Kansas City, but he was just young enough that he missed that first wave of the Ramones and Blondie and television. But sort of that ripple effect, like the hallowed halls of CBGB's, like he was like, that music was still buzzing around the place, but like the next generation. And so that was where he came up. I think he said that he went to the school, the FAME school, the musical performing and music and arts performing school. And not to give too much away, but he says that he started playing around with recording equipment and just making music that way, and really, really influenced by what was going on around him, and not the stuff that I was influenced by in a Cleveland suburb in the 80s. He was, I think he said that he did listen to some of the 80s hair metal, but that really wasn't his thing. And just started making music. Again, without too many spoilers, they signed with Simple Machines, which was a pretty reputable label.
Scrawl,
there you go. Yeah. It's funny to look back this many years later on a label like Simple Machines, because Adam tells me that, everything ran out of Jenny Toomey's basement. So it was not like this big headquarters or anything. It was people making tapes in somebody's basement and mailing them out.
Right.
But that was their start. They started with Simple Machines, and they thought that was as great as it would be. I mean, they were excited to be on Simple Machines, and and you'll hear the story about how they ended up on Geffen. It's a really interesting story. All of their friends along the way. This band is quintessential Dig Me Out. They're a band that don't have a recognizable household name. You probably don't know any of their songs, but they were around throughout the entire 90s, putting out a lot of music, touring with bands. They toured with Cake. They toured with Southern Culture and the Skids. They got signed, I believe they got signed, or maybe they were out on the road when they got dropped with they went out on tour with Lisa Loeb. So like they have all these connections, and yet, like I said, they're a band that not many people know about. Just one other thing to point out is they sort of broke up after the major label thing fell apart, and got back together. Unfortunately, due to a circumstance, their drummer passed away from cancer. Tim, I think you told me the year was 2007.
Yes.
So that kind of brought them back together, and they have been putting out music. Like just it's amazing how much they put out since that time. It's almost like an album a year. They use Bandcamp pretty heavily. Adam was kind enough to send me 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 CDs. So they're putting out CDs as well of that music, and really kind of the whole way this interview came about is they are right on the verge of re-releasing something that had been long out of print. Some of their earliest stuff called Swiss Army Knife. And on the packaging, it says Lost Mommyhead Teenage 4-track gems from the mid 80s. So some of the earliest stuff that they recorded, it's 21 songs. There's some couple live from CBGB songs on there. So that was sort of the reason I got in contact with Adam in the first place, was to help him talk about and promote this long lost demo that is finally seeing the light of day.
They
Cool.
have 11 records on streaming, going back to 89. That's pretty amazing.
Yeah, you know, Adam talks about how it's pretty easy for him to record these days, and so it's just a matter of getting people together and sending tracks back and forth with each other when they can't get together. And you know, I think they're sort of in that point now where it's like it's fun now.
Mm-hmm.
No pressures.
Yeah, no pressures at all.
No pressure, no expectations.
Yeah,
right. That's our motto here at no expectations and no pressures. We show up, we do it, and that's how it goes. Chip,
It's
thanks.
Kind of the secret to happiness.
Yeah, it is. It is. Thanks for doing another interview. We always look forward to these, and I know that these are a big hit now with the community. They love not only your current interviews, but all the stuff that the retro stuff that you've been throwing up on our Discord, which people should definitely join the Discord or join the Patreon to get access to that Discord, because there's a lot of good stuff from your Swizzle Stick eras and things that are only available via the Wayback Machine.
Yes,
which is cool.
Yes,
the internet never forgets.
So I'm working on a bunch of other interviews, so stick around. You know, again, Adam is probably somebody in Mommyheads or a band you probably don't know, but it's a great conversation. He's a really friendly, great guy. Had a lot of great stories that will. I don't want to say fill in the blanks of the 90s, but he's got a lot of 90s stories. So I think everybody will enjoy it, even if you don't know the band's music. And go to Bandcamp because you can stream it all.
Excellent. All right. Thanks, Chip. Let's get to the interview.
So let's start off by asking, like we were talking before we started, tell me about sort of the end of the 80s, early 90s, where you were physically, where you were living, what you were doing, and then sort of mentally, like what sort of place were you in your head as a teenager or as an early 20-something, whatever 1990 was for you?
Yeah, so I was a 4-track kid. I had a Yamaha 4-track that was my whole world. I was of that 4-track generation, which was pretty amazing back then. The ability to take a cassette tape that you could buy in any store, put some piece of metal on the back, it was like a little strip, and turn it into 4 tracks. And you can take 3 tracks and put them onto one, and then take 3 more onto one, which was similar to what the Beatles were doing and the Stones and the Kinks. They were sort of doing the rhythm section in 1 track, mono, which was actually a great sound, the sound of mono drums. There's no phasing. It's just real punchy. And they just kept dropping them into tracks. And so I had that same ability as a 15-year-old. I was like a little scientist. And, you know, there were a lot of us out there, the Sebados and the early Dinosaur. I mean, we all had those 4-track tape machines, and I'm proud of being part of that and feeling like it was limitless to have any cassette could become another world. And we're actually re-releasing or giving an official release to the Simple Machines 4-track demos that we did in the 80s, which was our first foray into being on a label with Simple Machines. And it was so weird that we were just kids. They were kids, you know, the Fugazi camp, the Teen Beat camp. And I sent those in just to get a reaction from Jenny Toomey, and she's like, I love this, I want to release it. And that was such a great feeling as a teenager to have someone else like your music and want to put it out. And even though they put out 100 cassettes, it felt so good.
Oh yeah.
Like, hey, someone likes this. And so there's just listening back to it, the enthusiasm is there, the technicality may not be there, and the sort of chops may not be there, but the pure enthusiasm to hear your 15-year-old self to 19-year-old self, and the whole experience was so much fun that I hope it conveys now that we're in our 50s.
Yeah.
And so that was the 80s for us. And Michael was a 4-tracker, our keyboard player, and we all sort of met. I went to Music and Art High School, the Fame School, and all the 4-trackers hung out and we discussed better ways to do it. And it was almost like concocting new potions. And it was science experiments with music and listening to other people's 4-tracks and getting ideas. How did you do this? How did you do that? And this was pre-Pro Tools, pre-cell phone, pre-internet. This was big. And so I loved anyone else that sounded like that. The artists that felt like that to me were not the metal bands of which I grew up with kind of liking because all my friends liked Iron Maiden, Judas Priest, Black Sabbath. It was more like the They Might Be Giants and Dubway, Al Houghton. Like those guys seemed like 4-trackers on steroids, and Fish and Roses, bands that would go in that had 3 hours because they had no money and just went crazy in the studio, recorded it, and then took it somewhere else cheaper and kept overdubbing. And early Flaming Lips, those are the bands that we really gleaned towards. We saw ourselves as heady, intellectual, keeping the light alive for bands like Television and Talking Heads were kind of burning out. And we wanted to be the new version of that, the new New York no wave. It ended up being a little more darker and Sonic Youthy and Dinosaur Jr., but I was part of a camp of people that loved James Chance and the quirky stuff, and they love Suicide even, because of the techno, 2 guys with synths. And our first gig at CB's, I've talked about this often. I didn't even think about it until this year, but our first gig together as this incarnation, 2 years ago, was opening for Crowded House by accident. Hilly Crystal was like, this band wants to take over the slot after you. And it was a Saturday night. And we saw them and thought, we need to get better. And that was the end of the 80s. And we decided kind of around that show, we need to play together. We need to practice. We need to record more. We need to be professional because these guys, it's literally the best show I've ever seen in my life at CB's Acoustic. And it's hard to get past that.
Oh yeah.
Still trying to up our ante to that experience of opening for them and not having our what together. So, and that was a band we felt akin with. I loved Time and Tide by by Split Enz. I loved Squeeze Argy Bargy, and it was smart. It wasn't afraid to play soft. It wasn't afraid to be notey and sensitive. And it kicked butt sometimes, but mostly it didn't just turn up to 11 and assume all you wanted to do was get your anger out. You wanted, as a male, get other things out. There were sensitive subjects, there were worldly subjects. Time and Tide is about being a sailor, and the ups and downs of wanting to navigate the whole world. And Squeeze were singing about relationships in other ways. And Graham Parker was singing about relationships in ways we never thought about. And Elvis Costello and Joe Jackson, he was going into being gay, like very openly. There was other things to think about other than goblins and, so I'm kind of being long-winded, but that was the 80s, trying to fight back against just masculine like too much masculinity in rock and trying to do something different.
Here's a question that you probably can't answer because you didn't live this way, but had you not lived in New York City, and that's where you lived at the time, correct?
Right.
Do you think that would have transpired your career the way it did? Because to me, I grew up in the suburbs of Cleveland, and I'm thinking like I didn't have older siblings. My parents weren't into music. I was spoon-fed MTV and FM radio. Like the bands you mentioned to me in the 80s, I don't even know if I had even heard of them. It was all, if I did, it was all quote unquote underground rock. But it sounds like by just a virtue of living in New York City and having CBGBs down the street, you were exposed to a lot of stuff. Do you think if you had grown up in Cleveland, Cleveland's probably not a good example because there's a lot of good underground music in Cleveland, but if you'd grown up somewhere other than a big city, do you think your music path would have gone the same way?
I want to think that who I am and who the Mommyheads are as people would drive us to those people in our town that liked Para Ubu, who were from Cleveland. Like we would seek out the bands touring through the Buzzcocks and go to that show and skip the Monsters of Rock. I would like to think that, but I think you're right. I think I used to go to CB's after school, and my parents never knew where I was. And I was the rugrat. I was always there. I would help sweep up if they let me. I did lights when the guy wanted to go do drugs in the alley. I did lights for the Pixies when they first came through. No one else wanted to do. I was up there as a 17-year-old. Just I couldn't tend bar. I couldn't do sound, but I tried to do other things.
Yeah.
And there was this feeling like, wow, the glory days are over. You know, the Blondie got signed and moved on, and television moved on, and they just visit once in a while, like kids who were, you know, we visit on Thanksgiving. That was the feeling, and we had missed it. We had missed the glory days, but I knew all about it from talk. And wow, I saw the Dickies when they were on New Year's Eve '79, and I was 9. I couldn't appreciate. I wasn't there, so I felt like I was definitely in sort of the after wave of the greatness of CBs and Tramps and, you know, Max's Kansas City. And I did know more about some of these bands that never toured, that should have, that were great. But, you know, New York was also a wasteland.
Yeah.
And there weren't a lot of places to play. There weren't, you know, it was the Village Voice, and that was it. And Chris DeGow was kind of obnoxious. In some ways, the smaller towns were insulated, and you had Euclid Tavern, and you had great places in Cleveland, and bands could actually grow in Ohio, like Scrawl and Poster Children and Guided by Voices and Brainiac, and they were able to incubate a little longer than New York, where if you didn't have a crowd after a year, people just didn't care. It was a little more, you know, your ego would get battered quicker here, and you know, in smaller towns, you can survive longer and kind of get your thing together.
Yeah.
There's a reason why Cheap Trick came out of the burbs of Illinois, and why some of these, you know, why to me the ultimate is Flaming Lips came out of Oklahoma. They were able to not pay attention to the naysayers and the haters, and go back home and just make their records and make their art and do their installations and tour when they wanted to. And New York was a little more brittle in terms of, you know, the career paths.
Yeah.
It was higher. It was more expensive. So yes, I think we wouldn't be the same. We wouldn't be the same band, but I don't know if it's better or worse, to be honest.
Yeah. So the 90s roll around, early 90s, and you're recording, you're putting out records. I think you started putting out stuff in the late 80s. You hook up with Jenny and Simple Machines in early 90s, 91, 92-ish.
I was sending them stuff in 88, 89, which is when we met. And yeah, they were wonderful. They literally made cassette copies in their basement on a TIAC machine.
Yeah. That's what
and they started a subscription service. They were the original Patreon.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's what I was wondering, you know, again, in historical, looking back on the time and my days of starting to write in the 90s, Simple Machines seemed like a really legitimate, I don't want to say powerhouse, but like but you're saying, you know, it started off as recording tapes in the basement and sending them out.
No, when people say we need culture these days, they had it.
Yeah.
What blew me away, our first label was Fang, which was Chris Rail, and he was from Bethesda, or he was from Maryland, and he knew DC. So we went down there and played shows, and that's how we fell into the whole teen beat. We opened for Unrest, we opened for Tsunami, and we fell into that whole scene. And what I loved about it is we were children of working class people in New York and had a different aesthetic altogether. It was more about, let's just put up posters and play shows, you know. Down there, they were sons and daughters of diplomats and had a world vision, and the conversations around the table were about where the world was at and politics on a global scale. And Jenny's still doing stuff like that. She's for the Ford Foundation. I mean, she's still a powerhouse because early on, it was almost like kids from Hollywood just become actors because that's all they know.
Yeah.
These kids were really smart. And when they did something in terms of like a label, it felt like a movement. And there was a political slant, and money went to charities that you never heard of, but then you learned about, and then you felt like you were part of something. And then it put you on the path of doing more charities and more benefit shows, and Velocity Girl would play benefit shows. And I was so blown away how different DC was from New York. And before the internet leveled the playing field and the whole world seemed like just one big glob, one place, one big blob, each city had its own feel. And the music out of there was heavy, but it was so politically charged. All the lyrics were so politically charged. It grated on my nerves that the guitars were out of tune and the drummer couldn't play. But then you'd hear these lyrics from, you know, bands like Minor Threat and tsunami, and they were like about real things that we were heading into to become young adults. So I felt so blessed to be a part of that scene. And I think anyone from a distance who saw it couldn't even grasp how are these kids so unified on all levels.
Yeah.
And how do they convince you to join them so easily? Because it's a political city and they just understand the gestalt of that. And it worked for them. Yeah. Whereas look, Dave Grohl's from DC. We did a split single with him after Nirvana when he had his demos for Foo Fighters. He knew there's something special about Simple Machines and about these bands. And then you go to LA like we did, and then you realize, wow, that's all about the opposite. They don't care about the world.
Yeah.
I mean, not everyone. It's the business side. It's about how many units did you move and who produced the record and who did the cover. And so the DC scene was pretty amazing in the 80s. I have to say, we were blown away.
And so I don't know if there's a formal signing to Simple Machines, but Simple Machines agrees to help you put music out. What was that? Was there bigger aspirations for Mommyheads? Was it Simple Machines are a stepping stone to the next thing? Or was it like, I'm just happy somebody's putting this stuff out for us?
Yeah, we never had a plan. We were probably like all those other bands that never had a manager or a manager that was focused on the plan.
Yeah.
There were bands when you read their memoirs, like Queen, they looked at Led Zeppelin and thought, we could do that. And they did it. And most bands that we knew, and including us, we didn't know what we're going to do next week,
right.
But we knew we wanted to make music. And so our biggest problem, and what made us most endearing to, people endear to us, is that we didn't have a plan and it was just about the music. And so even when we finally got a manager and we were signed and we were 5 records in, we still didn't know. Everyone, Urge Overkill had the logos together and everybody had logos and they kind of looked like Sunoco or they looked like Getty. We never did a logo. Every font has been different. Every cover has been different. Every theme has been different. But the cool thing is that when you do it for the music and that's what you're doing, there is a consistency that the music should be good.
Yeah.
Whereas when you do it for other reasons, there's a bunch of clunkers in your catalog and things you don't want to play people. And there's a lot of bands that made the clunkers and it was embarrassing and had the logo.
Yeah.
So we definitely fell into the trap of not caring enough about the business side and about the 5-year plan. And yeah, we're definitely going to be in a tour bus in 3 years because we always saw that as mana. It was like, it's all just fake. Like just because if you have a tour bus, you're in more debt. When we played with Sunny Day Real Estate and they had the tour bus, or whoever, Cake got finally got it, you got to sustain that.
Yeah.
And it's something you dream about because it's almost like you're told to dream about it by the system. And we were fine in the van. We were fine in a car. And so we suffered from it and also are still around because we didn't get bogged down by that.
Yeah. So you were playing shows in Baltimore, DC, kind of going down to play just more so because that's where Simple Machines, and you felt like you were kind of in with that crowd, or were you actually doing some real touring besides that?
We always toured.
Okay.
And we would book ourselves and the local station would play us once and I'd call the club and go, hey, we're getting played off the charts. It's amazing. Oh, come down. The thing about back then was different from now is it's so easy to have analytics now. Every move you make has to be crowdsourced and focus grouped. And what are the numbers from the last show? And we don't want to take a chance unless we know we're going to make our return plus profit. Back then, every town had one dude like yourself, like me, who just loved music and wanted to see the show as a fan. And so they would book 4 bands that just sounded similar or complementary. Or he's like, you need to know these 3 bands. I'm putting you on. They're a little heavier, but they're going to love you. And there was this camaraderie that the internet kind of blew away.
Yeah.
And there was no analytics. And some shows would have 10 people. Some shows would have 300. It depended on the night and what the competition was. So we kind of fell into these bills where we just kept opening for great bands. We go to Columbus and open for Superchunk. And I would find out about them that night. And then we would go to Toronto and open for Unrest and find out about Unrest. And you'd constantly becoming fans at Sunny Day in Kalamazoo, Michigan, and Tragically Hip in East Lansing, and John Spencer's Blues Explosion in Chicago, and Alex Chilton. And, it was nonstop opening for bands where the booker was invested in terms of quality in terms of making a good night as a fan, not just as a businessman. And that's what we kept falling into, and we couldn't stop.
Yeah.
And we were so addicted to playing with Southern Culture and the Skids, and, you know, and just all Timbuk 3, just the Ween, just get thrown on bill with 2 shows with Ween back to back in Texas because the booker liked Ween and liked us. And that was the vibe back then. And why I hate playing now is they want us to headline. They want to know what our draw is, and they may cancel on us if there's not enough pre-sales. There was no pre-sales at Euclid Tavern.
Yeah.
So that's what we miss. And that's why I was so much better in that one department when it was not focus grouped back then.
And that explains a lot. When I would, you know, I didn't do a ton of traveling when I was in my early college years, but, you know, go on a spring break somewhere, go to visit a relative, and you'd pick up the free paper and you'd see some of those bills that you're talking about that I never understood. Like, how does Red Meat end up on a bill with Boss Hog? And it's because, right, it's because the promoter is bringing these 2 bands who are traveling through the area. They're not touring together. And some of those bills seemed a little bit weird, but that it makes a lot of sense that you'd book these bands together from a promoter perspective, because that's who you want to see.
I love when you open for a band like Boss Hog, which I think we did, or you open for a band like Jesus Lizard or whatever. And one of the guys is like, you know, I'm an in the closet XTC prog guy. I love Beefheart. And he's like, I hear that in your music, and don't assume anything. I love your band, and check out our second record, 3rd song, first side. Sounds like we listen to the same, you know, and you have this conversation where all the walls are down. And you have something in common with a dude from a band that's way heavier and has a different crowd, but all of a sudden you have this new friend.
Yeah.
And the booking agent was so open-minded. They heard that and knew that you needed, you know, even though it doesn't seem right on paper, that you needed to be part of that scene. And I've had so many conversations like that, and left becoming fans of bands I never thought I'd be fans of, and friends with bands I never thought I'd be friends with, because something broke through and they liked our lighter sound, our sensitive pop sound.
Yeah.
And they loved, you know, everything Tears for Fears ever did and Crowded House. And they're like, I hear it in your music. Let's be pen pals, you know? And you don't get that now. You're just put into like this or that. And, you know, we're filed just like Spotify playlists right now. And it's very sad, but you know. Oh, well.
Did you have any, while you were doing all that kind of touring, did you have any what you would consider sort of brother or sister bands that you did hook up with a little bit more often out on the road?
Yeah. I mean, the ultimate for us is we played, I got a demo tape from Cake. It was 4 songs and no one knew them. And I loved it and called their manager, and I brought them to San Francisco, and they basically opened for us for 10 shows until they had their own feet on the ground and surpassed us, you know, quickly. And then, you know, I've helped him get a manager and booking. I've had a booking agent that I hooked him up with. We were the older brother band, and then we ended up touring with them later on, and it was amazing. Every time we were on tour and they were on tour, we'd find some shows to play. Yeah. And even though their music, it's highly intellectual, very swarmy, and never veers off its course musically. It's always kind of similar, but they were probably one of the best bands I've ever played with. They were just a stellar group of guys that can play. And the lyrics were great and current, and the development wasn't as much as I wanted. They never made they weren't interested in doing a Sgt. Pepper, but on the other hand, they were smart. They mined that one sound and they own it. Yeah. And so that was the band in the 90s that we felt most akin to. And there were tons of other bands, the Posies, Jellyfish, the Rain Parade, that whole scene, Game Theory. I mean, there were a lot of bands that I don't know if you ask 99 people on the street out of 100, they won't know who Game Theory is, or the Loud Family, but they should know. And there's very few bands that represent that ever got big enough, meaning the grunge scene had Nirvana and they had Pearl Jam and they had Mudhoney. But in terms of that pop scene, there's not a lot of bands that got to that level where they were the bellwether. And so whole scenes, like the Laws got big because of a cover, and They Might Be Giants did their own thing, but there weren't really any, bellwether bands for those scenes, and the whole scenes are gone. Whereas no one discusses those bands, and they're so good. So lots of bands we were friends with that most people will never hear. It's, American Music Club. We played with the Red House Painters in a small club, and I thought American Music Club did it first, but that's just me. So there is literally, you could write a War and Peace novel on the bands that no one knows about but should.
Yeah.
And that's what you guys do. So
yeah,
thank you.
So what so I can read the bios, and I've read some interviews. You moved from New York to San Francisco. The whole band did, or part of the band, right? And
so the band that had its first gig, there was one incarnation of high school where there were three of us. Two fell off, and the two other guys from another band joined, and that gig from Crowded House, CBGB's, that band moved to San Francisco, which was Michael Holt, Dan Fisherman, and I. And New York was getting too grungy. Dinkins was mayor, and it was getting a little, you were going to get mugged. It wasn't if, it was, or it was when. And we met some bands from San Francisco, and they said, it's really gorgeous out here, and there's a scene. And we got out there, and Thinking Fellers Union was happening. We loved them. We moved to the same block as the Residents, who we absolutely adored. And you had your harder stuff, Gilman Street, and we were neighbors with Jawbreaker, and we worked in the same stores. And there was a scene, and it felt smaller, more Cleveland-esque, I should say, where it was like tightly knit and away from the world, whereas New York was always, all the press was here, Spin was here, Rolling Stone was here, LA, everything, all eyes were on those cities, where San Francisco felt off the beaten track. So it was a good fit for us.
Yeah. Was that an obvious choice, or had you considered, let's look at Chicago, DC, Detroit, San Francisco, or LA and figure out which one we fit in? Or was San Francisco just sort of like that just felt right?
The other choice for me personally was North Carolina, Chapel Hill. And a lot of it was the beginnings of Ben Folds, who we did a show, and Caleb Southern, their sound guy, did it. And we got into a long discussion about Ben Folds, but it wasn't big enough for us. We wanted something a little bigger.
Yeah.
And the Bay Area as a whole was a lot larger, and there were more places to play. And the ultimate reason was Camper Van Beethoven, Pitch a Tent Records were kind of interested, and we loved Camper. And by the time we got there, they folded, and they were on Virgin, and we were like, hey, we're here. So, but we were always friends with those guys, and they're the sweetest people on the planet. And those records still hold up. Key Lime Pie. And so we felt like if the Santa Cruz sound is here, and Camper's here, and these other bands are here, like, it's beautiful. So why not?
Yeah.
So that was our college as a band.
Yeah. When you moved out there, like, you were mid-20s, early 20s. What was the
20 to 30? Age
okay.
20 to 30.
And was the band self-sustaining, or you said you worked alongside some of the guys in Jawbreaker and stuff, so you were working jobs to pay the rent and touring and playing records and stuff, or making records?
Yeah, I mean, we were only self-sustaining on Geffen, and they were just a bank that loaned us a lot of money. But before that, I think we always had day jobs. Yeah. Which is to me, and I could talk later about it, but that's what you want to do. You want to not worry about the finances and make the best music possible. And we learned that was compromised by getting the loan from a major label. So that was an experience. But all those guys had day jobs. Yeah. To be honest, even the Counting Crows musicians, because the lead guy was making most of the money. A lot of guys had side gigs, and everyone was playing everywhere. David Immergluck, who was in Monks of Doom, Counting Crows, everyone was hustling. So we were all doing that. There was definitely less studio work in San Francisco than New York. So, we had our day gigs, and that was totally fine.
Yeah. What was the first record you put out when you moved to San Francisco? Was that
It was called Flying Suit, and it was on Dromedary Records, a label in New Jersey. I'm micro indie, as they call it. And we got a new bass player, Jeff Palmer, who was in Sister Double Happiness, and after we broke up, joined Sunny Day Real Estate because we were friends. And so we did Flying Suit, and then Peter Cadis, who eventually produced The National and Interpol and Sting and Fish, probably one of the biggest indie producers of the last 20 years, came to a show in New York and wanted to produce his first real record with us. And that was called Bingham's Hole. And that was a wonderful experience to have a real future star, learning the ropes with you, and just being an A+ producer.
Now, you said that was recorded in New York.
Bingham's Hole was recorded in Greenwich, Connecticut.
Okay.
and in his parents' basement.
So after moving to San Francisco, then you come back to the East Coast to record the record?
Well, we would go on tour, and if somebody wanted to record with us who wasn't in San Francisco, we would hold a week on the tour, whatever city that would be in.
Got it.
So, and luckily he was in Greenwich, and we could see our relatives in New York and spend a couple weeks, and it was wonderful.
In elementary school, my dad was a commercial airline pilot and flew out of Kennedy Airport. So my kindergarten through 6th grade, before my parents got divorced, I grew up in New Canaan, Connecticut. So I'm familiar with Greenwich and Norwalk and all those.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you get to fly a lot of places for free.
We did. Yeah. Then my parents got divorced, and I didn't take advantage of that. As an adult, I look back and I'm like, man, I could have. My dad had friends who were pilots who would wake up in the morning and say, I feel like getting real Kansas City barbecue. I'm going to hop on a plane and go eat lunch in Kansas City and then fly back and have dinner here. Yep. And I was too young to take advantage of and understand like the gold mine that I had that I should have taken advantage of. But
that
so
is awesome.
Yeah. So it's funny you mentioned Jeff as well. So Sister Double Happiness, they're an integral part of my writing story, in that I did not interview them. So Soundgarden was coming to Columbus, which is where I live. And I really wanted to interview Soundgarden, and I was writing for the college paper, and A&M Records said, yeah, they're only doing college articles that are like front page, top of the fold.
That's how you become big, right there.
Yeah. And I was like, yeah, I really want to meet them, but there's no way my paper is going to let me do that. So I'm going to look at the underbill and see who's opening. And it was Sister Double Happiness and Blind Melon.
Oh,
and
yeah.
I knew Blind Melon, the record wasn't out. I only knew Blind Melon because Shannon Hoon was in Guns N' Roses video.
Yep.
So it came down to those two bands. Who was I going to, and I interviewed Blind Melon and became, I'm actually like still to this day friends with him, lifelong friends with him. But Sister Double Happiness was on that bill. And I'm not sure if Jeff was in the band. Was he in around those days? It would probably be 91, 92.
He was in the band in 91. Yeah.
Okay. Very cool.
They were a very important band. That lead singer, what charisma, and groundbreaking with his, his whole stance, being openly gay, and his lyrics, I mean, were intense, and their whole mixture of blues and rock, we felt different. It wasn't ZZ Top. It was some new thing,
Yeah.
Like 90s version of that vibe.
And then there was at least one, was it one or both of the women were in Imperial Teen after that?
The guitarist and the, I don't know if it was his wife or his girlfriend became Imperial Teen, which great things too.
Yeah.
And they were San Francisco. So that was really cool.
Yeah. So you're in San Francisco. You're starting to get some buzz. I've read a little bit about sort of how Geffen became aware of you. Again, was that something that, were you even pursuing that, or was that a means to an end, or was it like, if everybody else is doing it, we should try to hop on and see what we can get out of this thing? Or was it just I don't know, like how did that?
Yeah, it's weird. Back then everyone seemed to know an A&R guy. It was like, you couldn't miss them. They were everywhere. And we got on a tour with Lisa Loeb. And for anyone who doesn't know Lisa Loeb, she was the Taylor Swift of 1995, 6, 7. Like she
Absolutely.
was. She came out of nowhere. She had a song in that movie and in the credits, and didn't have a deal. And so she had a bidding war like no one had seen before for one song. And Geffen paid so much money, and then she became the next thing for them, because they were looking for the next Nirvana since 93 when he died. And Guns N' Roses had broken up around 93, 94, whatever, and Axl was losing his mind. So they had really nothing of that level. And so they really pushed her. And we got on that tour when they first signed her. So we just had friends that knew each other, and she was a big fan. And the Bingham's Hole record did kind of well. It wasn't front page anywhere, but it was really well reviewed. So we had a buzz, indie buzz, whatever that means. And so we were playing with her. We did 15, 20 shows up and down the Eastern Seaboard, as small as a House of Blues to as large as outdoor, mini amphitheaters. And it was eye-opening. She had tour buses and crews, and she was super sweet, and she was on Geffen. And we also had other friends, like the Southern Culture were on Geffen. And their A&R guy, they were, was looking around, and they said, you should check this band out. They're, don't miss it. Don't miss the boat. So Todd Sullivan, who also had signed Weezer, came out to St. Louis to see us, and literally right after the show said, I want you guys. And we, it's an amorphous thing that just sort of happens one day.
Yeah.
You're at the right show. And And we came back, and it was quick. And we had the same manager with Don Was, and they asked us what engineer we like, and we loved Wildflowers by Tom Petty, so it was Jim Scott, who was Wilco's engineer forever, and the Rolling Stones, and all of a sudden it went bam. You know, we were in LA a lot, which we didn't like, but they were down there, and it was like a bidding war between them and Sire, and we got a big time manager who was not the nicest person openly to people in negotiations, but said he was defending our interests, and that became sort of a dark. You know, the recording was amazing, but then realizing that you're a number in a game, you know, you're a rabbit in a race, became grueling for us, because we just wanted to make music.
Yeah.
We had nothing in our band had any star power potential in it, you know.
When you got the offer in St. Louis, at that point, did you have a manager, or at that point were you guys still just the four of you?
We had someone who almost wanted to take a chance on us, or maybe we had a manager, and his other acts were Herbie Hancock, Don Was, Maxwell, Dream Theater. I think we were working with him, and he got really pit bullish with them and extorted as much money as possible, which is what managers are supposed to do.
Yeah.
But the more money you get, the more pressure you have, and there better be a hit on that record.
Yeah. I think we all learned, maybe people knew this before me, but I feel like I learned a lot from Jacob from Semisonic's book.
I didn't need to read that. I keep hearing about it.
You know, where as a kid, I'm growing up and I'm watching MTV, and I'm seeing these $1 million videos, and I'm seeing tour buses, and you know, in high school, I'm going to the arena shows where it's a 15 truck bus tour, and I'm thinking, man, you guys are all loaded. You leave this tour and you go home and you drive the nice cars and you live in these mansions. And then you start reading that, exactly like you said, labels are a bank. They're loaning you the money, and you're paying for the catering at the photo shoot, and you're paying for all these different things along the way. And that, to me, and again, maybe I was a little bit blinded to it, but that was really like the time that my eyes got open to the realities of what signing a major label deal was like. And so it sounds like you experienced that.
Oh, it's amazing. Once there's money in your camp, the sharks smell it. It's chum in the water. And, you know, we were in the studio, we were at Ocean Way, and like Mick, the dude from Foreigner, walks in and says hello. And the guitarist, Waddy Wachtel, walks in and says hello. I mean, it just was a string of people walking in, shaking our hands. We didn't earn their respect. Willie Nelson walks in, Leon Russell. I mean, it was like Rick James. I was like, what's going on? It felt so weird, because a month before that, I was, you know, at my video store job, rewinding cassettes, you know, and the stack was high. I wasn't getting home till midnight, and here I am shaking hands with the dude from Foreigner, and talking to Jack Joseph Puig, who just did the Weezer's, you know, song, and meeting, hanging out with John Bryan and Amy Mann, all my heroes, and Michael Penn, and it was endless, you know, and we loved it, but we also knew something is wrong. We did not earn the respect of these people. And it's all about the money. Once you have $500,000 to $1 million for a record in somewhere floating around in the ether, you have people who are there to do those things to eat the money away, which is the tour bus company, the snare rental company, the drum rental company, Saphir Backline, the booking agent, the you know, the tour manager, the hotels, the travel agent. I mean, there's a list of people who are set to do things just for you. Their service industry to utilize that money, to spend it completely. And it's not profit for you at any point. It is just to make one song pop on K-Rock. And if you don't have the ability or the song, it goes away fast. And when we came in, we said, you know, we're not a typical hit-making band. We're more like a Dave Matthews, you know, Fish, not musically at all, but
sure,
we want to cultivate. We want to have a long-term thing where, you know, we have 20 records and a huge catalog, and, you know, you don't get one song. No one's waiting for the one song at the end of the show. They want to hear the whole show. We're that band. And they said, yeah, sure. That's the way we're going to do this. And they still wanted that one song.
Yeah.
And so you realize it is an industry that perpetuates around that loan. Once the loan is out, everyone starts coming around. Once you're dropped, crickets.
Yeah. Yeah.
Crazy.
When the Geffen self-titled is not your debut, but the self-titled debut for Geffen came out. Did they put you on the road? Did you guys go out on the road to support that, or were you dropped pretty much as soon as it came out, or even before it came out?
They were, since we had the Cake friendship, they were hoping we would tour with Cake, so they wouldn't have to work too hard. They didn't want to work too hard.
Yeah.
And Cake had a big tour and a big hit, The Distance, and we were booked for it. And then something happened where they canceled it. And then they had to have a meeting again. Hey, the tour's not happening. The record has been put out. What do we do? And this is what I heard from the meeting, that they just decided to bag it.
Yeah.
And didn't really go to bat for us and say, don't worry about it. You'll go on tour with Weezer or something else. Then they probably re-listened to it in a meeting and said, what the hell is this? This sounds like light indie music. Why would we want to invest into this? You know, maybe that week they had a hit with, who knows, a metal band or something, or, you know, like a Korn had a hit that week. They look at the week and then they look at you before that more money gets doled out for whatever, and go, oh, that sounds nothing like this, bag it. So that's what happened. It was like a meeting on a bad week for us or something, and they just said, let's move on to something else. And the whole year of making the record and all the effort just goes away.
Was it a unceremonious dropping, or were you called into an office and told like, hey, we're going to let you guys go? Or do you remember like how that, was there a phone call? Was there a meeting, or was it just sort of, you realized that people weren't returning calls?
We had two A&R guys. The other A&R guy was Tony Berg, who had Amy Mann and Counting Crows and Peter Gabriel. And we really looked up to him, and he brought us to a dinner where they put the fish in the lap. You know, he had a dinner at his house, and he goes, I'm sorry to tell you, but, you know, we had a meeting. It didn't go well. And Geffen's not doing well, blah, blah, blah. And that, you know, then you're like, you're 20, whatever, 27, and you're going to live, you know, go back home and sulk for, you know, which is what we did.
Yeah.
And then we broke up, and that was that.
Yeah. So that kind of gets us through the 90s. But you didn't stop making music either as a solo artist, or you were doing other things. I mean, the Mommyheads, for all intents and purposes, stopped for a little while, for 10 years or so. But I imagine as a creative type person, whether or not people heard your music or not, you're not going to just stop cold turkey and go back to that video store and rewind tapes for the rest of your life.
Oh no, I'm a frantically creative person. I'm always creating. So I did a solo record and played shows in San Francisco, and actually had big shows. I opened for Cake, and that was fun. And we just did a local release. Remember those?
Oh yeah.
Digital CDs only in local stores. And then I moved to LA because I had a deal with RCA. And then RCA, you know, I had Artist Direct booking me, and it looked pretty good. And I was opening for Tenacious D, nice guys. And then they had issues, Artist Direct, and RCA dropped them, and then I got dropped. And then at that point, I'm like, it's almost 2000. I'm gonna go to New York. My family lives here. And I moved back to New York and I got a real career, which was jingle writing for 8 years. And then we got back together. Our original drummer passed away in 2007 from high school, and we got back together in 2008. It was a great show, packed full of fans. And we looked at each other and said, we're not getting any, you know, younger. Let's do this. And we started making records in 2008 again, and it's been joyous.
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
and you've put out a lot of music, and I haven't looked at all the different streaming services, but Bandcamp has your whole catalog.
Bandcamp is amazing.
Yeah.
It's the best in a world of Spotify's and Apple iTunes, where you get nothing. If anything, you lose money, and it's all free, and it gives the wrong impression to people who want to take an art, meaning some hard drive in Sweden is going to go down one day, or there's going to be a lawsuit in Finland, and all of a sudden all our music goes away. In a world of that, Bandcamp actually gives you $8 for every 10 spent. It's actually the best deal I've ever seen. It's better than labels. So we're definitely on Bandcamp, and then we do the Spotify's and other services. But if you actually want to own MP3s or AIFs, Bandcamp is great. You just download. And so we have, since 2008, we've done like 7 records.
Yeah.
And we're actually living the dream of being a band who you don't go to the show for one song for, you go for the whole show. and it's very diversified, and we could play one song from each record and have a full show. And that's the band we wanted to be,
Yeah.
which is a heritage band, and not a one-hit wonder or whatever that is. So it's been fun since then.
It's sort of weird, like in hindsight, and I don't really mean this seriously, but it's almost like a lot of bands starting out would have been better off maybe having a quote unquote real career until they turned about 30, 35, and then started the music thing where they could appreciate and understand. Because I imagine the 20s were fun for you. But really, like like where you're at now is way more rewarding than those fast and loose days when you were running around the country in a van and playing in front of 10 people one night, 300 people the next night. And you probably wouldn't trade it for anything, but you're probably in a better place today, I would guess.
We are in a better place. I'm in a better place. We love what we love. We see every moment as a gift now because of wisdom and age. And the music sounds like that.
Yeah.
It's vibrant.
Yeah.
But I will say that labels thrive off people who don't know better.
Yeah.
Because, in some respect, you're the trained monkey on the music box. They're spending money on you to do what they say or do what you think they want, which is go out and play the Warped Tours and get in the van and don't shower for a month. You're too smart at this point to do any of that. So everything is in reverse. It's a reverse world. Most industries thrive off people being too young to know. Most industries, whether it's models going to Melon at 17, 18, like my sister did. But I wouldn't change a thing, but I do think you're right. I think on a musical pure art form level, I wish I could have done this back then.
Yeah.
It was also harder to make records back then. You did need money. You needed some finance. You needed to pay an engineer, a producer, a studio. Each town had one or two good studios, not like now where every bedroom's a good studio.
Right.
So there's less music from the 90s. There's less music from the 80s, even less from the 70s, and very little from the 60s, and a minute amount of music from the 50s. So now there's more music and everything's inverted. Like, it's harder to get to. It's harder to know what's going on.
Oh yeah, for sure.
What's good? There's piles and piles every day. Check me out. Look at me. Back then, if you actually made a record, it was such a feat of engineering that everyone was like, yeah, of course I'll listen to your record. So everything's inverted, and you just have to accept where you're at and try to just do the best you can do with what you have and where you're at.
So I feel like I read horror stories from bands who aren't able to get access to their old music, especially with major labels. But, I see your album, your Geffen record on Bandcamp. Is that all clear and in your name and all good for you guys to have it? Or how did you end up with being able to put that back out?
This is the craziest thing. When we were dropped, I distinctly remember having paperwork or discussion that we got the music back. Of course, that paperwork, it's 30 years ago, so I can't find it. But so I'm like, it doesn't exist anywhere. Geffen just let it go. So I take sort of an approach of, people need to hear this record. I'm going to send it to radio because we're sending all these other reissues out. And here, radio, here's a record from 97 that is lost in it's gone, that you should know about. And it does well at radio. It charts in the top 100 last spring. And people are like, wow, this is so great. Thank you. It's so great you got it back. Meanwhile, my lawyer is like, let me double check. And their lawyer goes, we can't find the paper. Oh, they sent us paperwork that says it didn't revert back. So my lawyer goes, well, it looks like you just have a top 100 college record that you can't really, make money off or claim that's yours. And I'm like, look, we don't make money off anything. So this is basically a promo thing. Literally a week later, it's on Spotify. So I basically woke the beast up and said, please take this seriously. And they, by jostling their legal department, put it on Spotify and iTunes, and it says 1997, and it's being reviewed all over again. And I personally don't care about making money. I just want it to be out there. So mission achieved. And now I have promo copies. I don't charge for them. They can't sue me. And I send them to DJs and press people that want to have a copy.
Yeah.
So that was the deal with that. It was a misread situation that worked in our benefit.
That's great.
I
feel like I keep making this up, but I feel like I really heard this in the Wilco documentary. Who's the Rolling Stone author? David Frick.
We just sat next to each other at the wall, at the Roger Waters movie, that live movie.
Okay. Yeah.
He's like, hey, Adam from the Mommyheads. I'm like, David Frick, he'll never review us, but it was nice to hang out with him.
And I swear he said this in the Wilco movie, but maybe I'm making it up out of that, what I wanted him to say. But I thought he said something like, there is always going to be a kid listening to the Beatles for the first time. And so, it's kind of like the record industry puts you in this time, like you have 3 months to promote it, 6 months to tour it, next record. But somebody hearing the 1997 Mommyheads record for the first time could write a review today about it, and it would still be relevant, and it would still, like to your point, it can still get played on the radio. We shouldn't look at music as time bound. We should look at it as timeless. And so anytime a person hears it for the first time, they should share their opinion.
That is such an optimistic approach, and I love it because I'm an optimist. I wouldn't do this if I was a pessimist.
Yeah.
I do think some music, because it defined an era, becomes timed out.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. When you hear someone going mumbling that 90s thing, it sounds like a Pearl Jam band, Yeah. But the thing with us is because we never had success with a hit, we're timeless by default. And so we put out Coming Into Beauty with a Simple Machines record last year. We reissued it, and it went to 67 on college radio. And everybody said, when did you record this? It sounds so current. Like, it sounds like they dropped all these other artists I didn't know,
Yeah.
And I'm like, no, guys, that's a 30-year-old record. So there's a time warp where time folds like paper, and it's the ultimate compliment, meaning we were so out of time that we can actually reissue records now and they sound current. Unlike if we were, if we're Mudhoney or something, it sounds like 91, and they had a lot more success. But the one bit of success we've had is the lack of success, because it's kept us artistically free, and we could do anything and have those wonderful conversations with press and radio.
Yeah.
And especially with 20-year-olds who are like mini versions of us. They don't leave that collection of LPs. They're like, whoa, who's Graham Parsons? And then the thing says Rolling Stones, and they go down a rabbit hole and they come out enriched. They love us.
Yeah.
And to me, that's the ultimate reward. And I'll make each record just for those guys.
Awesome. I have two questions. One maybe easy, one maybe easy too. Maybe a quick answer. When was the last time you saw a Mommyheads CD in a used bin at a record store?
It's very rare.
Is it?
Yeah, I'm actually told by record store owners, oh, I had one, it sold. It's like I won't actually see one. I'll just hear about it.
Yeah. So it's been a long time.
Yeah, I don't think there's a lot out there.
Yeah.
The reason we put Coming Into Beauty out again, and what the impetus for it was, I saw one on Amazon for $900. It was an original Simple Machines pressing. And I'm like, God, that is the scam on that is someone's trying to do that with all these records, hoping somebody's willing to pay $900. And I knew it was kind of ridiculous, but I'm like, let's just make it available.
Yeah.
And I feel bad for record stores with it being free, music being free. But that said, I have a lot of records that will never be on Spotify. The legal problem is there. They didn't sell enough units. It was just not enough for anyone to, it costs $60, $70 to put it into the system now. Somebody doesn't want to pay that.
Yeah.
So there's a dearth of stuff. There's not enough on Spotify, to be honest, of stuff I care about.
Yeah.
There was a band called The Records that had a hit, and a bunch of other records that are not on Spotify. There's so many post-punk and punk bands and new wave bands that will never be on Spotify. So there is a need to go into those record stores for guys like us, but they can't survive just off us. They need more than that. So I don't know if they'll be around in 10 years to be
so like I said, I live in Columbus, Ohio, and we actually have, at last count, eight record stores. Yeah, it's pretty amazing. And they've been in the last 10 years. So, I mean, they haven't always been here, but Columbus apparently supports vinyl buying to the point where the main record store that I used to go to that was on Ohio State campus and bought all my, they sold all the promo CDs. So you could I could walk out, for $15, I could walk out with 6 or 7 CDs instead of buying a new one. They barely even sell CDs anymore. It's the whole store is like wall-to-wall vinyl. So, there are at least in Columbus, there's a market for it. People are still buying it.
I think there is an opening for baby boomers retiring, and their kids of baby boomers don't know what to buy them. So
Yeah.
we buy them. It's like, hey, mom, how about a record player, and I'll supply you with Carole King and Bob Seger, and and so we end up going to shopping for our parents.
Yep.
And that market alone is enough to keep record stores open, I hope. I don't think it'll make it to my kids' generation, but I'm glad. Look, there's seeing art on a record you can't beat it.
Nope.
So, and I still, my brain functions in a 30 to 45 minute, flip the record over, say what you got to say, get out. I never understood CDs where they maxed it out with 80 songs. I'm bored by the time the 30th song is around. I need a limit. And LPs, by their limitation, is how I see music. I see it as a concept record from the first needle going down to it coming up from side 2. And that's the way I'm trained.
So as part of the whole Dig Me Out podcast, and if you go back and listen to some episodes, that is a hot topic, because the 90s were the CD era, and people were filling them 74 minutes worth of music. And they have the two hosts, Tim and Jay, sort of have a rating system, and they could say, a good album, a better EP, or a better single. And they sort of break down an album, how many songs really were good and how many were the filler. So that's a heavily talked about topic on Dig Me Out. So
I feel very strong about this.
yes.
I like bonus tracks if it's like Bandcamp and digital, but when it comes to hard copy and LP, we all our records from now on, like the last 3 to 4 records, and whatever we can do until we can't do it anymore, 10 songs, 40 something minute, whatever gets the best quality. And the music should be good enough where you feel like you've had that experience and you're done.
Yep.
It's like dessert. You've had your appetizer, your port, your main dish, whatever. The same way you function with a meal, you function with an LP. And if it's too long and it starts to lose its quality, you're screwing up.
Yep.
10, 11 max. Keep the bonus tracks for the download. If you really love the band and you need to hear them live in Boise, fine. But make sure that record is solid, because I'd say 99% of the time, if there were tracks that were left off the record and you hear it, you're not that psyched about it because the artist wasn't.
Right.
There was a reason it was left off. And it kind of kills it,
So final question to close things out. Again, realizing it was, we're now 20 to 30 years ago. If you could kind of sum up the 90s, how would you sum up the 90s from your perspective?
Well, we felt out of place. So personally for us, we would have preferred the 70s, 80s, or 2000s when Death Cab came around and told us they missed us. And it was adversarial and it was very masculine to me. It was like a masculine decade. I think Generation X was frustrated. That Woodstock documentary where they burned the whole place down didn't seem that far-fetched to me. We were living it. It's not my favorite time, but we existed in it, and I have to cherish it as well. And I have amazing memories from it. And there were a treasure trove of bands that no one knows about that need to be heard. And one of the ultimate reasons why I love continuing as a band is because when, if you love a pair of shoes and there's a cobbler somewhere and they're nice Italian shoes, but just need a little sole reinforcement, you can't take them to Walmart. And you don't want to be part of this disposable society where you just throw it away. You take it to some cobbler who's in his 80s who fixes it up new. That person exists for that need. And we exist to keep the flame going of this type of music, whatever this type of music is. It is 80s, 90s music, born in the 70s, and is kind of current and also completely out of place in 2022. So we are musically, when you listen to us, it seems very familiar, and yet we're trying to say something fresh. So we need to continue, because a lot of bands were crushed under the weight of their own success or lack of success. And there's too few bands doing this. So it's almost historically significant for us to keep going. And to me, that's what I think of when I think of the 90s, and I think of why we still exist.
Awesome. That is a great way to tie it up. So appreciate you taking the time. And
I appreciate what you're doing. So
yeah.
the love is evident and it's appreciated. So and one day we'll pick a record and dive in.